1972, Lode Lane, Solihull, England. A tall, square, slab-sided vehicle rolls out of the Land Rover factory. The cab sits forward over the engine. The wheels stick out beyond the body like cartoon tractor tyres. A Rover V8 engine idles beneath the bench seat, almost between the legs of the driver. The whole thing looks like a brick on wheels. A child's drawing of a truck. It looked boxy. It looked wrong. It looked like nothing else Land Rover had ever built. Engineers questioned the proportions. The cockpit was so cramped that drivers later complained there were 50 ways to cut yourself or bruise your leg climbing in. Officers wondered why the army needed such an awkward, top-heavy machine when the standard Land Rover had served for 2 decades. It would go on to serve in the Falklands, the Gulf, Bosnia, Kosovo, and northern Iraq. It would tow Britain's primary field gun for 23 years. It would outlast 2 attempted replacements. It would defend British troop concentrations during the largest desert deployment since the Second World War. It would carry the wounded across half of Europe. It would cross the Sahara in 81 days. And in 1994, when the Ministry of Defence finally tried to retire it, the army would refuse to let it go. Its designation was the Land Rover 101 Forward Control, and it was the only purpose-built dedicated military Land Rover ever made. To understand why the 101 existed, you need to understand the problem Britain faced in 1965. The British Army had just approved a General Staff requirement for a new artillery piece, a 105mm weapon to replace the aging Pack howitzer, used by airborne and commando units. That gun would enter service in 1976 as the L118 Light Gun. It would weigh 1,858 kilograms in combat trim, significantly heavier than its predecessor. Too heavy for the standard Series 3 Land Rover to tow with a 6-man gun crew, ammunition, and rations. The previous attempt at a forward-control military Land Rover, the Series 2B109, had failed, underpowered, unstable, universally described as ill-fated. Britain needed a new vehicle. It had to tow a 4,000-pound gun across any terrain in the world. It had to carry 6 gunners plus driver and commander. It had to fit inside an RAF Andover transport aircraft, and it had to be light enough to be slung beneath a Sea King helicopter. In 1966, Rover at Solihull and the Military Vehicle Engineering Establishment at Chertsey formed a joint design committee. The project engineer they appointed was a draftsman named Norman Busby. He would later be known throughout the industry as Mr. 101. His method for sizing the cab is among the most quotable origin stories in British military engineering. He sat down with a measuring tape. He placed 4 British soldiers, 22 inches wide each, side by side on a workshop floor. Then he added a 10-inch wide spare wheel between them. The result gave him a wheelbase of 101 inches. The vehicle's name was determined by the width of the men who would crew it. Competitors were evaluated and rejected. The Austrian Steyr Puch Haflinger was tested. So was the Volvo. Both were judged unsuitable. Britain wanted its own design. The first prototype arrived in summer 1967. It carried a 3-litre straight-six petrol engine. The Military Vehicle Engineering Establishment tested it and returned a single verdict: underpowered. By December 1968, the prototype had been rebuilt with the new ex-Buick 3.5-litre Rover V8, mated to the brand new LT95 combined gearbox and transfer box. 120 brake horsepower, 176 pound-feet of torque, permanent 4-wheel drive with a lockable centre differential. A constant speed-power takeoff. The numbers told a story. The vehicle weighed 1,924 kilograms empty. It could tow 4,000 pounds. It could ford water. It could climb a 1 in 3 hill. Its turning circle was 37 feet. Its top speed was officially limited to 75 miles per hour, supposedly to prevent accidents, although every serving soldier knew it would do more. It also drank fuel like a thirsty diesel locomotive, targeted at 14 miles per gallon on road. In service, it returned 6 to 12, towing a fully laden gun, sometimes less. There was one final feature: a 2-wheeled trailer built by Rubery Owen, with its own driven axle powered by the prop shaft from the truck. The whole combination became an articulated 6x6. 10 prototype trailers were built. They worked, in theory. In practice, on a 1 in 3 test hill at the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment, the trailer kept driving when the truck lost grip. It pushed the 101 onto its side. Recovery was achieved by engaging reverse and letting the trailer push the vehicle back upright. The Tank Museum holds a photograph of the rollover. The powered trailer was abandoned. The 101 entered production in 1972. Now, before we get into where this vehicle actually fought, if you are enjoying this deep dive into British military engineering, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. By 1982, More than 2,600 101s had left Solihull. 1,700 had gone to the British Army. The rest were exported mainly to Australia. The vehicle had been in service for 10 years. It had never seen combat. That changed on the 2nd of April 1982, when Argentine forces seized the Falkland Islands. The British task force sailed within days. 3 Royal Artillery formations brought 101s with them. 29 Commando Regiment Royal Artillery, under Lieutenant Colonel Michael Holroyd Smith, 4th Field Regiment Royal Artillery, and T Battery, Shah Suja's troop, of 12 Air Defence Regiment, with 12 Rapier missile launchers each towed by a 101 tracking radar tractor. Sergeant Steve Brooks's launcher was reportedly operational within minutes of coming off the landing craft. What happened next was the great paradox of the Falklands War. The 101s were deployed in numbers, 6 per gun battery. They were carried halfway around the world to fight on East Falkland, and they were almost never used in their designed role. The reason was the ground. East Falkland was peat bog, diddle-dee scrub, whitegrass tussock, quartzite stone runs. There were almost no roads outside Stanley. Wheeled vehicles sank to their axles within minutes of leaving a track. 97 Battery's own history records guns moving 7 or 8 feet in the bog when emplaced. The Royal Marines and the Parachute Regiment yomped and tabbed across camp on foot. Then came the second blow. On the 25th of May, an Argentine Exocet missile struck the container ship Atlantic Conveyor. 3 of the 4 British Chinooks on board were destroyed, 6 Wessex helicopters, a Lynx. The heavy lift capacity of the entire task force was gutted in seconds. Only 1 Chinook remained. Bravo November, tail number Z, a 718, of 18 Squadron RAF. It had been airborne at the moment of the strike. The L118 guns the 101s had been built to tow now flew everywhere as helicopter underslung loads. The trucks themselves sat largely static at the San Carlos beachhead. 16 101 ambulances of Tenfield Workshop Remy ran casualties from the front to the field hospitals. The Rapier tractors stood watch over the bridgehead, missiles live, scanning the sky for incoming Skyhawks. On the 27th of May, 3 guns of 8 Llama battery were flown by Sea Kings of 846 Naval Air Squadron into Camilla Creek House to support 2 Para's assault on Goose Green. The guns went underslung. The gunners and roughly 1,000 rounds went inside the cabins. The 101 tractors stayed behind. By the evening of the 28th, after Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones had been killed leading the final attack, the brigade ammunition area held only 83 rounds in reserve. The most cinematic gun lift of the war came on the night of the 30th of May. Squadron leader Dick Langworthy flew Bravo November alone in a snowstorm. 3 guns of 7 Sphinx battery on board, 2 stuffed inside the fuselage, 1 slung beneath, 22 gunners crammed into the cabin. The landing zone proved to be sloping marsh. The Chinook briefly sank at the rear into peat bog. Argentine mortars opened up. Gunner Van Royen of 7 Sphinx broke his arm taking cover among the rocks. For the assault on Mount Longdon on the 11th of June, Captain William McCracken of 29 Commando was forward observer with B Company 3 Para. Bombardier Edward Holt earned the military medal that night. For the final battle of the war, at Wireless Ridge on the 13th and 14th of June, Lieutenant Colonel David Chandler had vowed that 2 Para would never go in without proper fire support after Goose Green. He turned to his battery commander, Captain Tony Rice, and asked for rate 6. 6 rounds a minute from each of the 12 guns supporting them. 2 batteries of 29 Commando Royal Artillery fired roughly 6,000 rounds in 12 hours. By the time the Argentines surrendered, British guns had fired close to 17,000 rounds. The 101s had carried wounded, defended airspace, and supported the bridgehead. Their ground had been the wrong ground, but the vehicle and the crews had survived. The next major deployment was Operation Granby in 1990, Britain's contribution to the Gulf War. The 101s returned to their original purpose. Photojournalist Bob Morrison personally photographed Rapier tractors guarding British formations in the Saudi desert in January 1991. Missiles live and not drill. They were the last line of defence for the British armoured concentrations preparing to recapture Kuwait. A small contingent supported 3 Commando Brigades' deployment into northern Iraq under Operation Haven, protecting the Kurds. Through the 1990s, 101s rolled into the Balkans, mostly as ambulances of 24 Field Ambulance, on roads where mines had been laid by every faction. And through the entire Cold War, 18 secret variants known as the Vampire stood near the east-west German border under 14 Signal Regiment, listening to Warsaw Pact radio traffic, their 21-metre telescopic masts unfolding silently in the dark. Their work remains partly classified to this day. On paper, the rivals looked superior. The Mercedes-Benz Unimog had portal axles, more torque, and a heavier payload. Britain rejected it as too big to fit inside an Andover and not helicopter portable. The American Humvee, when it arrived in 1985, offered crew protection and stability. It also weighed nearly twice as much as the 101 and could not be carried under a Sea King. The French Renault offered better fuel economy from its diesel engine. It was less air portable. The British doctrine was different. Britain built its army around airborne and commando brigades. Vehicles that could be dropped from a Hercules at 800 feet, slung beneath a helicopter, and packed inside transport aircraft. The 101 paid for that capability with a thirsty engine and a high centre of gravity. It was the trade-off the Ministry of Defence had chosen. Replacement attempts began in the 1980s. Land Rover proposed the Llama, a Defender 110 based forward control with a fiberglass cab. 11 prototypes were built between 1985 and 1988. The Ministry of Defence rejected it. Land Rover, fearing it could not compete commercially against the Unimog without a guaranteed military order, killed the project. The Ministry's chosen replacement was the Reynolds-Boughton RB44, an 846 vehicle contract worth £25 million, signed in June 1988. It became one of the most documented procurement disasters in British military history. The brakes failed. In August 1993, REM testing found that 37 of 57 in-service vehicles veered left under heavy braking at 35 miles per hour. By December 1993, the Quartermaster General declared the entire fleet vehicle off the road. Britain had no replacement. The Army turned back to the 101 and ordered the fleet overhauled. Land Rover offered the Ministry a comprehensive refurbishment programme. Re-engine every 101 with a modern diesel, redesign the cab, extend the service life by another decade. The cost would be a fraction of new vehicles. The Ministry of Defence declined. The actual replacement, when it finally arrived in 1995, was the Pinzgauer 716 from Steyr Daimler Puch, the lineal descendant of the Haflinger that Britain had rejected in 1966. The vehicle Britain had spent 30 years not buying was now the vehicle Britain had to buy. The 101 was withdrawn from frontline service by the end of 1998. The ambulance variant soldiered on into 1999. The L118 Light Gun, by contrast, is still in British service today, 50 years after entering it. The vehicle had outlived its tow, but not all of them. Roughly 700 examples survive. The Dunsfold collection in Surrey holds the lead truck from the 1975 Trans-Sahara expedition, known as Tail End Charlie, which squadron leader Tom Shepherd drove from the Atlantic to the Red Sea in 81 days. 31 were rebuilt as city cabs for the 1995 Sylvester Stallone film Judge Dredd. One serves coffee from a Help for Heroes mobile cafe in southern England, and 101 forward controls remain in everyday use in the Falkland Islands today, on the very ground where they sank in 1982. 1972. Lode Lane, Solihull. The first 101 rolls out of the factory. It was boxy. It was top-heavy. It drank fuel by the gallon. The cockpit was an ergonomic catastrophe. The prop shaft hummed on overrun. The powered trailer flipped its tractor onto its side. The replacement program failed. The Ministry of Defence refused to extend its life when offered the chance, and yet it worked. It worked at the San Carlos bridgehead, where every other wheeled vehicle sank in the bog. It worked in the Saudi desert, where its Rapier launchers stood watch over Britain's preparation to liberate Kuwait. It worked on the broken roads of Bosnia, carrying United Nations casualties through 3 winters. It worked across the Sahara in 1975, when 4 trucks crossed a continent in 81 days. It works today on the Falkland Islands, towing peat across the same ground where it failed in 1982. Soldiers called it the One Tunny. They abused it with impunity. They loved it without sentiment. Its replacement is foreign. Its gun is still British. And on the islands where it was supposed to make its name, the One Tunny is still working for a living. That is not luck. That is what happens when an army builds a vehicle to fly.